Chapter 4 of Annie Besant by Annie Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tim Freeberg Renwick. Marriage. The last year of my girlish freedom was drawing to its close. How shall I hope to make common sense readers understand how I became betrothed maiden ere yet 19, girl wife when 20 years had struck? Looking back over 25 years, I feel a profound pity for the girl standing at that critical point of life, so utterly, hopelessly ignorant of all that marriage meant, so filled with impossible dreams, so unfitted for the rôle of wife. As I have said, my daydreams held little place for love, partly from the absence of love novels in my reading, partly from the mystic fantasies that twine themselves round the figure of the Christ. Catholic books of devotion, English or Roman, it matters not, for to a large extent they are translations of the same hymns and prayers, are exceedingly glowing in their language, and the dawning feelings of womanhood unconsciously lend to them a passionate fervour. I longed to spend my time in worshipping Jesus, and was, as far as my inner life was concerned, absorbed in that passionate love of the Saviour, which among emotional Catholics really is the human passion of love transferred to an ideal. For women to Jesus, for men to the Virgin Mary. In order to show that I am not here exaggerating, I subjoin a few of the prayers in which I found daily delight, and I do this in order to show how an emotional girl may be attracted by these so-called devotional exercises. Quote, "O crucified love, raise in me fresh ardours of love and consolation, that it may henceforth be the greatest torment I can endure ever to offend Thee, that it may be my greatest delight to please Thee. Let the remembrance of Thy death, O Lord Jesu, make me desire and pant after Thee, that I may delight in Thy gracious presence. O most sweet Jesu Christ, I, unworthy sinner, yet redeemed by Thy precious blood, Thine I am and will be, in life and in death. O Jesu, beloved, fairer than the sons of men, draw me after Thee with the cords of Thy love. Blessed art Thou, O most merciful God, who didst vouchsafe to espouse me to the heavenly Bridegroom in the waters of baptism, and hast imparted Thy body and blood as a new gift of espousal and the meet consummation of Thy love. O most sweet Lord Jesu, transfix the affections of my inmost soul with that most joyous and most healthful wound of Thy love, with true, serene, most holy, apostolical charity, that my soul may ever languish and melt with entire love and longing for Thee. Let it desire Thee and faint for Thy courts, long to be dissolved and be with Thee. Oh, that I could embrace Thee with that most burning love of angels. Let Him kiss me with the kisses of His mouth, for Thy love is better than wine. Draw me, we will run after Thee. The King hath brought me into His chambers. Let my soul, O Lord, feel the sweetness of Thy presence. May it taste how sweet Thou art. May the sweet and burning power of Thy love, I beseech Thee, absorb my soul." Unquote. All girls have in them the germ of passion, and the line of its development depends on the character brought into the world, and the surrounding influences of education. I had but two ideals in my childhood and youth, round whom twined these budding tendrils of passion. They were my mother and the Christ. I know this may seem strange, but I am trying to state things as they were in this life story, and not give mere conventionalisms, and so it was. I had men friends, but no lovers, at least to my knowledge, for I have since heard that my mother received 2 or 3 offers of marriage for me, but declined them on account of my youth and my childishness. Friends with whom I liked to talk, because they knew more than I did, but they had no place in my daydreams. These were more and more filled with the one ideal man, and my hopes turned towards the life of the Sister of Mercy, who ever worships the Christ, and devotes her life to the service of His poor. I knew my dear mother would set herself against this idea, but it nestled warm at my heart, for ever that idea of escaping from the humdrum of ordinary life by some complete sacrifice lured me onwards with its overmastering fascination. Now one unlucky result of this view of religion is the idealization of the clergyman, the special messenger and chosen servant of the Lord. Far more lofty than any title bestowed by earthly monarch is that patent of nobility straight from the hand of the King of Kings, that seems to give to the mortal something of the authority of the immortal, and to crown the head of the priest with the diadem that belongs to those who are kings and priests unto God. Viewed in this way, the position of the priest's wife seems second only to that of the nun, and has therefore a wonderful attractiveness, an attractiveness in which the particular clergyman affected plays a very subordinate part. It is the sacred office, the nearness to holy things, the consecration which seems to include the wife. It is these things that shed a glamour over the clerical life which attracts most those who are most apt to self-devotion, most swayed by imagination. And the saddest pity of all this is that the glamour is most over those whose brains are quick, whose hearts are pure, who are responsive to all forms of noble emotions, all suggestions of personal self-sacrifice. If such in later life rise to the higher emotions whose shadows have attracted them, and to that higher self-sacrifice whose whispers reached them in their early youth, then the false prophet's veil is raised, the poverty of the conception seen, and the life is either wrecked, or through storm wind and surge of battling billows, with loss of mast and sail, it is steered by firm hand into the port of a nobler faith. That summer of 1866 saw me engaged to the young clergyman I had met at the mission church in the spring, our knowledge of each other being an almost negligible quantity. We were thrown together for a week, the only two young ones in a small party of holiday makers, and in our walks, rides, and drives we were naturally companions. An hour or two before he left, he asked me to marry him. Taking my consent for granted, as I had allowed him such full companionship, a perfectly fair assumption with girls accustomed to look on all men as possible husbands, but wholly mistaken as regarded myself, whose thoughts were in quite other directions. Startled, and my sensitive pride touched by what seemed to my strict views an assumption that I had been flirting, I hesitated, did not follow my first impulse of refusal, but took refuge in silence. My suitor had to catch his train, and bound me over to silence till he could himself speak to my mother, urging authoritatively that it would be dishonourable of me to break his confidence, and left me, the most upset and distressed little person on the Sussex coast. The fortnight that followed was the first unhappy one of my life, for I had a secret from my mother, a secret which I passionately longed to tell her, but dared not speak at the risk of doing a dishonourable thing. On meeting my suitor on our return to town, I positively refused to keep silence any longer, and then out of sheer weakness and fear of inflicting pain, I drifted into an engagement with a man I did not pretend to love. Drifted is the right word, for 2 or 3 months passed, on the ground that I was so much of a child, before my mother would consent to a definite engagement. My dislike of the thought of marriage faded before the idea of becoming the wife of a priest, working ever in the church and among the poor. I had no outlet for my growing desire for usefulness in my happy and peaceful home life, where all religious enthusiasm was regarded as unbalanced and unbecoming. All that was deepest and truest in my nature chafed against my easy, useless days, longed for work, yearned to devote itself, as I had read women saints had done, to the service of the church and of the poor, to the battling against sin and misery. What empty names sin and misery then were to me. "You will have more opportunities for doing good as a clergyman's wife than as anything else," was one of the pleas urged on my reluctance. In the autumn I was definitely betrothed, and I married 14 months later. Once, in the interval, I tried to break the engagement, but on my broaching the subject to my mother, all her pride rose up in revolt. Would I, her daughter, break my word? Would I dishonour myself by jilting a man I had pledged myself to marry? She could be stern where honour was involved, that sweet mother of mine, and I yielded to her wish as I had been ever wont to do, for a look or a word from her had ever been my law, save where religion was concerned. So I married in the winter of 1867, with no more idea of the marriage relation than if I had been 4 years old instead of 20. My dreamy life, into which no knowledge of evil had been allowed to penetrate, in which I had been guarded from all pain, shielded from all anxiety, kept, innocent on all questions of sex, was no preparation for married existence, and left me defenceless to face a rude awakening. Looking back on it all, I deliberately say that no more fatal blunder can be made than to train a girl to womanhood in ignorance of all life's duties and burdens, than to let her face them for the first time away from all the old associations, the old helps, the old refuge on the mother's breast. That perfect innocence may be very beautiful, but it is a perilous possession, and Eve should have the knowledge of good and evil ere she wanders forth from the paradise of a mother's love. Many an unhappy marriage dates from its very beginning, from the terrible shock to a young girl's sensitive modesty and pride, her helpless bewilderment and fear. Men with their public school and college education, or the knowledge that comes by living in the outside world, may find it hard to realize the possibility of such infantile ignorance in many girls. None the less, such ignorance is a fact in the case of some girls at least, and no mother should let her daughter, blindfold, slip her neck under the marriage yoke. Before leaving the harbourage of girlhood to set sail on the troublous sea of life, there is an occurrence of which I must make mention, as it marks my first awakening of interest in the outer world of political struggle. In the autumn of 1867, my mother and I were staying with some dear friends of ours, the Robertses, at Pendleton, near Manchester. Mr. Roberts was the poor man's lawyer, in the affectionate phrase used of him by many a hundred men. He was a close friend of Ernest Jones, and was always ready to fight a poor man's battle without fee. He worked hard in the agitation which saved women from working in the mines, and I have heard him tell how he had seen them toiling, naked to the waist, with short petticoats barely reaching to their knees, rough, foul-tongued, brutalized out of all womanly decency and grace, and how he had seen little children working there too, babies of 3 and 4 set to watch a door, and falling asleep at their work to be roused by a curse and a kick to the unfair toil. The old man's eye would begin to flash and his voice to rise as he told of these horrors, and then his face would soften as he added that, after it was all over and the slavery was put an end to, as he went through a coal district, the women standing at their doors would lift up their children to see Lawyer Roberts go by, and would bid God bless him for what he had done. This dear old man was my first tutor in radicalism, and I was an apt pupil. I had taken no interest in politics, but had unconsciously reflected more or less the decorous Whiggism which had always surrounded me. I regarded the poor as folk to be educated, looked after, charitably dealt with, and always treated with most perfect courtesy, the courtesy being due from me as a lady to all equally, whether they were rich or poor. But to Mr. Roberts, the poor were the working bees, the wealth producers, with the right to self-rule, not to looking after, with the right to justice, not to charity, and he preached his doctrines to me in season and out of season. I was a pet of his, and used often to drive him to his office in the morning, glorying much in the fact that my skill was trusted in guiding a horse through the crowded Manchester streets. During these drives, and on all other available occasions, Mr. Roberts would preach to me the cause of the people. "What do you think of John Bright?" he demanded suddenly one day, looking at me with fiery eyes from under heavy brows. "I've never thought of him at all," was the careless answer. "Isn't he a rather rough sort of man who goes about making rows?" "There, I thought so," he thundered at me fiercely. "That's just what I say. I believe some of you fine ladies would not go to heaven if you had to rub shoulders with John Bright, the noblest man God ever gave to the cause of the poor." This was the hot-tempered and lovable demagogue, as he was called, with whom we were staying when Colonel Kelly and Captain Deasy, 2 Fenian leaders, were arrested in Manchester and put on their trial. The whole Irish population became seething with excitement, and on September 18th the police van carrying them to Salford Jail was stopped at the Bellevue Railway Arch by the sudden fall of one of the horses, shot from the side of the road. In a moment the van was surrounded, and crowbars were wrenching at the van door. It resisted. A body of police was rapidly approaching, and if the rescue was to be effective the door must be opened. The rescuers shouted to Brett, the constable inside, to pass out the keys. He refused, and someone exclaimed, "Blow off the lock." In a moment the muzzle of a revolver was against the lock and it was blown off, but Brett, stooping down to look through the keyhole, received the bullet in his head, and fell dying as the door flew open. Another moment, and Allen, a lad of 17, had wrenched open the doors of the compartments occupied by Kelly and Deasy, dragged them out, and while 2 or 3 hurried them off to a place of safety, the others threw themselves between the fugitives and the police, and with levelled revolvers guarded their flight. The Fenian leaders once safe, they scattered, and young William Allen, whose one thought had been for his chiefs, seeing them safe, fired his revolver in the air, for he would not shed blood in his own defence. Disarmed by his own act, he was set on by the police, brutally struck down, kicked and stoned, and was dragged off to jail, faint and bleeding, to meet there some of his comrades in much the same plight as himself. Then Manchester went mad, and race passions flared into flame. No Irish workman was safe in a crowd of Englishmen, no Englishman safe in the Irish quarter. The friends of the prisoners besieged Lawyer Roberts' house, praying his aid, and he threw his whole fiery soul into their defence. The man who had fired the accidentally fatal shot was safely out of the way, and none of the others had hurt a human being. A special commission was issued, with Mr. Justice Blackburn at its head. "The hanging judge," groaned Mr. Roberts, and it was soon in Manchester, for all Mr. Roberts' efforts to get the venue of the trial changed were futile, though of fair trial then in Manchester there was no chance. On October 25th the prisoners were actually brought up before the magistrates in irons, and Mr. Ernest Jones, their counsel, failing in his protest against this outrage, threw down his brief and left the court. So great was the haste with which the trial was hurried on that on the 29th, Allen, Larkin, Gould, O'Brien, Maguire, and Condon were standing in the dock before the Commission charged with murder. My first experience of an angry crowd was on that day as we drove to the court. The streets were barricaded, the soldiers were under arms, every approach to the court crowded with surging throngs. At last our carriage was stopped as we were passing at a foot's pace through an Irish section of the crowd, and various vehement fists came through the window, with hearty curses at the damned English who were going to see the boys murdered. The situation was critical, for we were 2 women and 3 girls, when I bethought myself that we were unknown, and gently touched the nearest fist. "Friends, these are Mr. Roberts' wife and daughters." "Roberts, Lawyer Roberts, God bless Roberts, let his carriage through," and all the scowling faces became smile-wreathen, and curses changed to cheers as a road to the court steps was cleared for us. Alas, if there was passion on behalf of the prisoners outside, there was passion against them within, and the very opening of the trial showed the spirit that animated the prosecution and the bench. Digby Seymour, Q.C., and Ernest Jones were briefed for the defence, and Mr. Roberts did not think that they exercised sufficiently their right of challenge. He knew, as we all did, that many on the panel had loudly proclaimed their hostility to the Irish, and Mr. Roberts persisted in challenging them as his counsel would not. In vain Judge Blackburn threatened to commit the rebellious solicitor. "These men's lives are at stake, my lord," was his indignant plea. "Remove that man," cried the angry judge, but as the officers of the court came forward very slowly, for all poor men loved and honoured the sturdy fighter, he changed his mind and let him stay. Despite all his efforts, the jury contained a man who had declared that he didn't care what the evidence was, he would hang every damned Irishman of the lot. And the result showed that he was not alone in his view, for evidence of the most disreputable kind was admitted. Women of the lowest type were put into the box as witnesses, and their word taken as unchallengeable. Thus was destroyed an alibi for Maguire, afterwards accepted by the Crown, a free pardon being issued on the strength of it. Nothing could save the doomed men from the determined verdict, and I could see from where I was sitting into a little room behind the bench, where an official was quietly preparing the black caps before the verdict had been delivered. The foregone "guilty" was duly repeated as verdict on each of the 5 cases, and the prisoners asked if they had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed on them. Allen, boy as he was, made a very brave and manly speech. He had not fired, save in the air. If he had done so he might have escaped. He had helped to free Kelly and Deasy and did not regret it. He was willing to die for Ireland. Maguire and Condon, he also was reprieved, declared they were not present, but, like Allen, were ready to die for their country. Sentence of death was passed, and, as echo to the sardonic "The Lord have mercy on your souls," rang back from the dock in 5 clear voices with never a quiver of fear in them, "God save Ireland," and the men passed one by one from the sight of my tear-dimmed eyes. It was a sorrowful time that followed. The despair of the heartbroken girl who was Allen's sweetheart, and who cried to us on her knees, "Save my William," was hard to see. Nothing we or anyone could do availed to avert the doom, and on November 23rd, Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien were hanged outside Salford Gaol. Had they striven for freedom in Italy, England would have honoured them. Here she buried them as common murderers in quicklime in the prison yard. I have found with a keen sense of pleasure that Mr. Bradlaugh and myself were in 1867 to some extent co-workers, though we knew not of each other's existence, and although he was doing much, and I only giving such poor sympathy as a young girl might, who was only just awakening to the duty of political work. I read in the National Reformer for November 24th, 1867, that in the preceding week he was pleading on Clerkenwell Green for these men's lives. According to the evidence at the trial, Deasy and Kelly were illegally arrested. They had been arrested for vagrancy of which no evidence was given, and apparently remanded for felony without a shadow of justification. He had yet to learn that in England the same state of things existed as in Ireland. He had yet to learn that an illegal arrest was sufficient ground to detain any of the citizens of any country in the prisons of this one. If he were illegally held, he was justified in using enough force to procure his release. Wearing a policeman's coat gave no authority when the officer exceeded his jurisdiction. He had argued this before Lord Chief Justice Erie in the Court of Common Pleas, and that learned judge did not venture to contradict the argument which he submitted. There was another reason why they should spare these men, although he hardly expected the Government to listen, because the Government sent down one of the judges who was predetermined to convict the prisoners. It was that the offence was purely a political one. The death of Brett was a sad mischance, but no one who read the evidence could regard the killing of Brett as an intentional murder. Legally it was murder, morally it was homicide in the rescue of a political captive. If it were a question of the rescue of the political captives of Varignano, or of political captives in Bourbon, in Naples, or in Poland, or in Paris, even earls might be found so to argue. Wherein is our sister Ireland less than these? In executing these men, they would throw down the gauntlet for terrible reprisals. It was a grave and solemn question. It had been said by a previous speaker that they were prepared to go to any lengths to save these Irishmen. They were not. He wished they were. If they were, if the men of England, from one end to the other, were prepared to say, "These men shall not be executed," they would not be. He was afraid they had not enough pluck for that. Their moral courage was not equal to their physical strength. Therefore he would not say that they were prepared to do so. They must plea ad misericordiam. He appealed to the press, which represented the power of England, to that press which in its panic-stricken moments had done much harm, and which ought now to save these four doomed men. If the press demanded it, no government would be mad enough to resist. The memory of the blood which was shed in 1798 rose up like a bloody ghost against them today. He only feared that what they said upon the subject might do the poor men more harm than good. If it were not so, he would coin words that should speak in words of fire. As it was, he could only say to the Government, "You are strong today, you hold these men's lives in your hands, but if you want to reconcile their country to you, if you want to win back Ireland, if you want to make her children love you, then do not embitter their hearts still more by taking the lives of these men. Temper your strength with mercy, do not use the sword of justice like one of vengeance, for the day may come when it shall be broken in your hands, and you yourselves brained by the hilt of the weapon you have so wickedly wielded." In October he had printed a plea for Ireland, strong and earnest, asking, "Where is our boasted English freedom when you cross to Kingston Pier? Where has it been for near 2 years? The Habeas Corpus Act suspended, the jails crowded, the steamers searched, spies listening at shebeen shops for sedition, and the end of it a Fenian panic in England. Oh, before it be too late, before more blood stain the pages of our present history, before we exasperate and arouse bitter animosities, let us try and do justice to our sister land. Abolish once and for all the land laws which in their iniquitous operation have ruined her peasantry. Sweep away the leech-like church which has sucked her vitality, and given her back no word even of comfort in her degradation. Turn her barracks into flax mills. Encourage a spirit of independence in her citizens. Restore to her people the protection of the law, so that they may speak without fear of arrest, and beg them to plainly and boldly state their grievances. Let a commission of the best and wisest among Irishmen, with some of our highest English judges added, sit solemnly to hear all complaints, and then let us honestly legislate, not for the punishment of the discontented, but to remove the causes of the discontent. It is not the Fenians who have depopulated Ireland's strength and increased her misery. It is not the Fenians who have evicted tenants by the score. It is not the Fenians who have checked cultivation. Those who have caused the wrong, at least, should frame the remedy. In December 1867 I sailed out of the safe harbour of my happy and peaceful girlhood onto the wide sea of life, and the waves broke roughly as soon as the bar was crossed. We were an ill-matched pair, my husband and I, from the very outset. He, with very high ideas of a husband's authority and a wife's submission, holding strongly to the master in my own house theory, thinking much of the details of home arrangements, precise, methodical, easily angered and with difficulty appeased. I, accustomed to freedom, indifferent to home details, impulsive, very hot-tempered, and proud as Lucifer. I had never had a harsh word spoken to me, never been ordered to do anything, had had my way smoothed for my feet, and never a worry had touched me. Harshness roused first incredulous wonder, then a storm of indignant tears, and after a time a proud, defiant resistance, cold and hard as iron. The easy-going, sunshiny, enthusiastic girl changed, and changed pretty rapidly, into a grave, proud, reticent woman, burying deep in her own heart all her hopes, her fears, and her disillusions. I must have been a very unsatisfactory wife from the beginning, though I think other treatment might gradually have turned me into a fair imitation of the proper conventional article. Beginning with the ignorance before alluded to, and so scared and outraged at heart from the very first, knowing nothing of household management or economical use of money, I had never had an allowance or even bought myself a pair of gloves. Though eager to perform my new duties creditably, unwilling to potter over little things, and likely to do swiftly what I had to do, and then turn to my beloved books, at heart fretting for my mother but rarely speaking of her, as I found my longing for her presence raised jealous vexation, with strangers about me with whom I had no sympathy, visited by ladies who talked to me only about babies and servants, troubles of which I knew nothing and which bored me unutterably, and who were as uninterested in all that had filled my life, in theology, in politics, in science, as I was uninterested in the discussions on the housemaid's young man and on the cook's extravagance in using butter when dripping would have done perfectly well, my dear. Was it wonderful that I became timid, dull, and depressed? All my eager, passionate enthusiasm, so attractive to me in a young girl, were doubtless incompatible with the solid comfort of a wife, and I must have been inexpressibly tiring to the Reverend Frank Besant, and in truth I ought never to have married, for under the soft, loving, pliable girl there lay hidden, as much unknown to herself as to her surroundings, a woman of strong, dominant will, strength that panted for expression and rebelled against restraint, fiery and passionate emotions that were seething under compression, a most undesirable partner to sit in the lady's armchair on the domestic rug before the fire. Que le diable faisait elle dans cette galère? I have often thought, looking back at my past self, and asking, why did that foolish girl make her bed so foolishly? But self-analysis shows the contradictories in my nature that led me into so mistaken a course. I have ever been the queerest mixture of weakness and strength, and have paid heavily for the weakness. As a child I used to suffer tortures of shyness, and if my shoelace was untied, would feel shamefacedly that every eye was fixed on the unlucky string. As a girl I would shrink away from strangers and think myself unwanted and unliked, so that I was full of eager gratitude to anyone who noticed me kindly. As the young mistress of a house, I was afraid of my servants, and so would let careless work pass rather than bear the pain of reproving the ill doer. When I have been lecturing and debating with no lack of spirit on the platform, I have preferred to go without what I wanted at the hotel rather than to ring and make the waiter fetch it. Combative on the platform in defence of any cause I cared for, I shrink from quarrel or disapproval in the home, and am a coward at heart in private while a good fighter in public. How often have I passed unhappy quarters of an hour screwing up my courage to find fault with some subordinate whom my duty compelled me to reprove, and how often have I jeered at myself for a fraud as the doughty platform combatant when shrinking from blaming some lad or lass for doing their work badly. An unkind look or word has availed to make me shrink into myself as a snail into its shell, while on the platform opposition makes me speak my best. So I slid into marriage blindly and stupidly, fearing to give pain, fretted my heart out for a year, then, roused by harshness and injustice, stiffened and hardened, and lived with a wall of ice round me within which I waged mental conflicts that nearly killed me, and learned at last how to live and work in armour that turned the edge of the weapons that struck it, and left the flesh beneath unwounded, armour laid aside, but in the presence of a very few. My first serious attempts at writing were made in 1868, and I took up two very different lines of composition. I wrote some short stories of a very flimsy type, and also a work of a much more ambitious character, The Lives of the Black Letter Saints. For the sake of the unecclesiastically trained, it may be as well to mention that in the calendar of the Church of England there are a number of saints' days. Some of these are printed in red, and are red letter days, for which the services are appointed by the Church. Others are printed in black, and are black letter days, and have no special services fixed for them. It seemed to me that it would be interesting to take each of these days and write a sketch of the life of the saint belonging to it, and accordingly I set to work to do so, and gathered various books of history and legend wherefrom to collect my facts. I do not know in the least what became of that valuable book. I tried Macmillan's with it, and it was sent on by them to someone who was preparing a series of church books for the young. Later I had a letter from a church brotherhood offering to publish it, if I would give it as an act of piety to their order. Its ultimate fate is to me unknown. The short stories were more fortunate. I sent the first to the Family Herald, and some weeks afterward received a letter from which dropped a cheque as I opened it. Dear me! I have earned a good deal of money since by my pen, but never any that gave me the intense delight of that first 30 shillings. It was the first money I had ever earned, and the pride of the earning was added to the pride of authorship. In my childish delight and practical religion, I went down on my knees and thanked God for sending it to me, and I saw myself earning heaps of golden guineas and becoming quite a support of the household. Besides, it was my very own, I thought, and a delightful sense of independence came over me. I had not then realised the beauty of the English law and the dignified position in which it placed the married woman. I did not understand that all a married woman earned by law belonged to her owner, and that she could have nothing that belonged to her of right. I did not want the money, I was so glad to have something of my own to give, and it was rather a shock to learn that it was not really mine at all. From time to time after that I earned a few pounds for stories in the same journal, and the Family Herald, to let me say, has one peculiarity which it should render it beloved by poor authors. It pays its contributor when it accepts the paper, whether it prints it immediately or not. Thus my first story was not printed for some weeks after I received the cheque, and it was the same with all the others accepted by the same journal. Encouraged by these small successes, I began writing a novel. It took a long time to do, but was at last finished, and sent off to the Family Herald. The poor thing came back, but with a kind note, telling me that it was too political for their pages, but that if I would write one of purely domestic interest, and up to the same level, it would probably be accepted. But by that time I was in the full struggle of theological doubt, and that novel of purely domestic interest never got itself written. I contributed further to the literature of my country a theological pamphlet, of which I forget the exact title, but it dealt with the duty of fasting incumbent on all faithful Christians, and was very patristic in its tone. In January, 1869, my little son was born, and as I was very ill for some months before, and was far too much interested in the tiny creature afterward, to devote myself to pen and paper, my literary career was checked for a while. The baby gave a new interest and a new pleasure to life, and as we could not afford a nurse, I had plenty to do in looking after his small majesty. My energy in reading became less feverish when it was done by the side of the baby's cradle, and the little one's presence almost healed the abiding pain of my mother's loss. End of chapter 4, part 1.